Welcome to the webinar. This is the third event, or the second half of the second event, if you prefer, in a series of stakeholder events organized by the Minnesota Department of Commerce around electrification in Minnesota. We're delighted to have you participating today. My name is Carl Samuelson, and I work for Michaels Energy, and I'll be the moderator for today's events. Michaels Energy is an energy efficiency consulting firm, and we implement and evaluate programs in Minnesota and in other states. And Michaels Energy is the Department of Commerce's contractor to organize and host these events. A few minutes ago, I published a poll. Please take a look at it and tell us about yourself. This poll will give us some insight into attendees' familiarity with different electrification topics. We should have another minute or two to respond to questions. Attendees are in listen-only mode. But we continue to want to encourage participation in this event. You can ask questions at any time during the webinar using the chat feature. During this webinar, we will be pausing for questions immediately following each of our three presenters. Please chat your questions to all panelists. You can find that in the drop-down options so that our whole team can see your question and we make sure that the presenters can respond to them. If you're having technical issues, please chat directly to our chat coordinator, Colin, who will do his best to help you troubleshoot your issues. He's going to chat out right now to everyone so you can reply directly to him if you're having an issue. The event is being recorded and will be posted to the project webpage in the near future, along with copies of slides. And you can see the project website right there at the bottom of this slide. Next, our agenda for the event. In a moment, I'll hand off to Anthony Fryer from the Minnesota Department of Commerce to introduce our speakers and offer some background on the goals for this webinar. Please stick around to the end of the event. We'll have another poll at the end to get more of your input as we plan for the next stage of the stakeholder engagement process. I am going to publish the survey results now. Gives everyone a few minutes to finish answering questions, or a few seconds. And we can look at the results. You know, a mix of people who have attended the past events. I'll make it bigger so I can see everything. A lot of familiarity with the Minnesota Conservation Improvement Program, which I had expected, and some moderate familiarity with electrification efforts in other states. And then, you know, generally pretty familiar or very familiar with heat pumps for residential homes, and same response for electric vehicles. And then somewhat less familiar with other electrification technologies beyond heat pumps or electric vehicles. Thanks for responding to that. I will now pass it over to Anthony.
Thanks, Carl. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Many thanks for joining us today. If you were with us a couple of weeks ago, thanks for joining us again. As Carl mentioned, my name is Anthony Fryer. I'm the Conservation Improvement Program Supervisor for the Minnesota Department of Commerce. And just want to take a few minutes here before we introduce the speakers to give a very brief overview on the Conservation Improvement Program, as the poll suggests that most are familiar with that. And then more about the project in general, and I will direct you to the project website that Carl had up there just a moment ago, which contains a lot of information on the project itself, but then also recordings of previous meetings and notes and everything else that went along with that will really give you the details of the project. So the Conservation Improvement Program is Minnesota's energy efficiency resource standard and the implementation of that. So we have about 120 electric and natural gas utilities that are required to meet a 1.5% energy savings goal. And the Department of Commerce plays a couple of roles with that. We regulate the program itself to make sure the utilities are meeting the requirements, and then we also provide technical assistance to help the utilities to meet that goal also. In terms of this project, the Minnesota Electrification Stakeholder Project, this is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy as part of their state energy program competitive grant process that we applied for a couple of years ago. And so the Minnesota Department of Commerce is the prime contractor on this project, with Michael's Energy, led by Carl Samuelson, as the subcontractor, and also Environmental Initiative, led by Malia Housenet, providing consultative services as well. So that's the team that we have here. In terms of the project goals, they are to, first of all, examine the benefits and concerns of electrification as a tool for grid optimization, energy efficiency, and emissions reduction in Minnesota. And then to convene a series of stakeholder meetings to provide information, facilitate discussion, and solicit recommendations on key electrification topics. So the purpose of this meeting and the two previous meetings that we've had this year is really to provide an educational forum to learn from one another and to share information around electrification with one another as well. And also the focus of today's meeting being to provide an overview of activities and initiatives happening around the country as well. And this is all in the hope that it informs the end result of this project, which is a report that provides considerations for Minnesota stakeholders that are interested in pursuing electrification activities, identifies and examines concerns and barriers around increased electrification, and then highlights areas for additional research. Next slide, please. So here are the immediate next steps that we have for this project. We did have a second stakeholder meeting a couple of weeks ago with a number of Minnesota-based speakers sharing their perspectives on electrification. We have today's meeting focusing on initiatives occurring at the regional, state, and local level. And then we're really, this fall, we'll be hosting a series of technical advisory committee meetings to develop a deep understanding on a number of issues concerning electrification, with the intent of reporting those findings and recommendations back to this larger stakeholder group, probably sometime early next year. A call for members of the Technical Advisory Committee was sent out earlier this year, and as I mentioned in the previous meeting, it will be limited to Minnesota stakeholders, and we would like to keep it to a group of about 25 organizations. And so in addition to those that have already volunteered their time for this process, we'll also be reaching out to additional organizations to ensure that there's an appropriate sort of representation of stakeholders that are involved. And Carl will be providing more information on that process at the conclusion of today's meeting. Next slide. So very excited this morning to introduce the speakers for today's session, and we certainly hope that the information on initiatives occurring around the country will better help Minnesota consider the benefits and challenges of increased electrification. And before I introduce the speakers, I did want to provide just a little bit of framing for those that are maybe less familiar with the Minnesota Conservation Improvement Program and the sort of policy setup that we have here. The first consideration, just to be aware of, is that there is a fuel switching prohibition in place within the Conservation Improvement Program. And so what that means is that electric and natural gas utilities participating in the Conservation Improvement Program are only allowed to direct those programs to existing customers with those existing end users. And this has been in place since 2005 with some limited exceptions. As many Minnesota stakeholders know, there's been a lot of conversation around this fuel switching prohibition in recent years, and legislation introduced that ultimately didn't pass that would have removed that prohibition. But just to certainly reiterate, that prohibition remains in place until something changes in the future. It's also just important to note that these examples from around the country come from different policy frameworks and initiatives that have been embraced and successful in other areas of the country may not be suitable for Minnesota. And that's sort of part of this whole conversation. And as we continue to talk about electrification, I think it's imperative that we absorb as much information and learn from the experiences of other organizations, states and regions as much as possible to inform our technical advisory committee and ultimately to inform the report that comes out of this process. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers, and I will introduce them all together, and then we'll start the presentations from there. There is a link to the speaker bios in this presentation for more background on that. So our first speaker today will be Sophia Mifsud, who is Senior Associate of Building Electrification at the Rocky Mountain Institute. Samantha Caputo is Senior Policy and Research Analyst with the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, or NEEP. And Jessica Allison will be our final speaker. She is Senior Policy Analyst for the California Public Utilities Commission. And as Carl said, please do use the chat feature to submit your questions. We'll have time after each presentation for the speakers to be able to answer them and hopefully some additional information at the end there. So with that, I will hand over to Sophia for the first presentation.
Everyone hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you all for having me. While I set up here my screen sharing, I'll just say a little bit more about who I am. So my name is Sophia Mifsud. I work for the Rocky Mountain Institute. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that has been around for almost 40 years, working in the space of energy efficiency and renewable energy. We were originally founded in the mountains of in the Rocky and being China. We're often people try to keep it to 2 minutes. And hopefully Jessica and Samantha can talk in a little bit more detail about what's going on in California and in the Northeast. So with that, I'll start with just framing what I will be talking about in today's presentation. I'll talk about 3 key approaches that we've seen cities and states and regional bodies focus on. And then I'll wrap up by talking about some areas of increasing interest around the issue of building electrification. So some of you are probably wondering why the big resurgence in building electrification in the United States. And I think this graph describes a little bit why there is an increasing interest, and that's because nationally, electric power emissions have decreased over time. Since 2007, they've decreased 34%, which is great, and we need to continue to bring those emissions down if we're going to meet our climate commitments. But unfortunately, the building sector, which just the direct combustion of fossil fuels in our buildings, account for 10% of all US carbon emissions. Those emissions are not going down. In fact, they're increasing over time as more people are connected to our gas infrastructure. And so lots of cities and states that have made climate commitments are turning to building electrification through the use of heat pumps as a way to reduce these emissions. And I know many of you are even bigger experts on the topic than I am. So, but I'll just mention what I mean by building electrification. And when I say building electrification, I usually use that interchangeably with the deployment of efficient modern electric heat pumps. Now, this technology has improved a lot over time. Modern heat pumps use a small amount of electricity to move heat rather than generate heat. This is different and more efficient than traditional electric resistance heating. This technology, because of the way it moves heat, it can often deliver 2 to 4 times more heating energy than the amount of electricity it consumes. This is true even in cold climates. The heat pump you see here is a heat pump of my colleague who is based out of Colorado and experiences lots of snow. But because of the efficiency of this technology, what you see is that even if you have an electrical grid that runs on gas, a heat pump is still more efficient when compared to a gas furnace or boiler. And of course, not all grids in the United States run on renewables and natural gas. So our team recently looked at whether heat pumps are emission savings opportunities throughout the United States. And what we found was that over the lifetime of a heat pump, which is approximately 15 years, 99% of American households will save emissions compared to the gas alternatives. This analysis, which I've linked to, and I'll just note that I've included lots of links for further reading in the presentation, so we won't have time to go through everything, but I encourage you to dig into these details if you're interested. But what we found is that only in the 2 most heavily reliant states on coal, Wyoming and Utah, that other than those 2 states, it is best for us to increase and accelerate the deployment of heat pumps because they are an emission savings opportunity compared to gas. And when compared to fuel oil, there's no question about whether heat pumps are a cleaner source of heat. So some of you are probably wondering why I'm focusing so much on heat pumps and why cities and states are focusing so much on heat pumps when thinking about building decarbonization. Efficiency, as you know, has been a key pillar to driving down these emissions, but an emerging space that lots of stakeholders talk about is renewable natural gas. I have I have here renewable natural gas in quotes, not in an attempt to be facetious, but rather because this term often is used to refer to several things. So when I am talking about renewable natural gas, I'm referring to 2 things. I'm talking about biogas, which is primarily produced from organic sources, and synthetic gas, which uses renewable electricity to produce synthetically methane or hydrogen. Now, there are 2 problems with renewable natural gas that make it not a viable alternative to decarbonize the building sector. The first is that even in the most optimistic analysis, these resources meet at most 12% of U.S. demand by 2040, by U.S. gas demand by 2040. In the most optimistic scenario, and other analysis put that number closer to 4%. So there's simply not enough. And the other big problem is that it's very expensive. Biogas gets more expensive over time, or the more you use it. And synthetic gas is expected to be 8 to 17 times more expensive than fossil fuel gas. So as a result, many cities and states are focused on the space of building electrification through the deployment of heat pumps. And often the first thing that they do is set some goal or commitment for their jurisdiction. And they're one of three ways typically that these jurisdictions will do that. The first will be to frame it within their larger emissions goals, like the city of Ann Arbor. They have recently set a goal to decarbonize the city by 100% by 2050. And within that plan, they have specific goals for building electrification. There are some cities like Denver, Colorado, that are taking a broader approach and are instead requiring fossil fuel reduction, as opposed to specifically calling out building electrification. And then there are some states like New York and Maine that are very explicit about their desire to promote heat pumps. Maine, for example, has recently made a commitment to deploy 100,000 heat pumps by 2025. And if they do it, will be one of the leading states in heat pump deployment. So often, goals and commitments are the first thing that states do, and often lead to more comprehensive policy and regulation action. And I'll mention three general categories that we've seen a lot of activity in. The first, and maybe has been the flashiest, is a lot of requirements throughout mostly California to prohibit the use of gas in new construction. This was started in Berkeley, California, and now over 30 cities in California have followed in this, in restricting the use of gas in new buildings. Notably, Brookline, Massachusetts also tried to restrict gas use in this way, but the Attorney General recently stated that this was not possible because it was because of the existing building codes and gas codes preempted this local action. So a lot of this restriction of gas is driven by local action. Another really exciting area of opportunity are building codes and standards. We're seeing cities and states consider not just requirements of all electric buildings, but also other ways to incentivize or promote electrification in buildings. And that could be through the implementation of electric-ready building codes or electric-preferred building codes. Another really interesting trend that we're seeing in this space is around building performance standards. I'm highlighting here St. Louis, Missouri, which recently passed the building performance standards that requires commercial buildings or large buildings to meet a certain standard that becomes more stringent over time and will eventually assure that they meet their climate goals. And the last, which I'll talk a little bit more about, is some exciting work in the regulatory space, where state regulatory bodies are considering how gas and fossil fuel investments overlap with their climate commitments. So I'm highlighting here Massachusetts, where the Attorney General recently petitioned the Commission to open a docket on the future of gas in the state. And there's a lot more I could say about the regulatory space in when thinking about building electrification. And instead, I'll point you to a report that we recently published, which highlights overarching recommendations to utilities commissions, but also specifically calls out some key strategies for addressing some of these regulatory barriers. So in addition to policy and regulation, some areas where we've seen a lot of activity has been in heat pump program deployment. And this has been especially successful in cold climate regions. I have here a map of the United States where there are active heat pump programs. This comes from a report from ACEEE. And what we're seeing is that heat pump programs, so programs that specifically incentivize the deployment of heat pumps, have grown nationally up to 70% from the prior year. So we're seeing big increases in heat pump deployment, but we're seeing this mostly done through efficiency measures. So they're pairing heat pump programs with weatherization, or are doing it as a way to transition from electric resistance heating to more efficient heatings, or are using it as a way to try to address their state's growing air conditioning loads. Many of these programs target delivered fuels, are mostly residential, and target midstream incentives. Notably, many of these programs also have specific carve-outs for low-income and vulnerable customers in order to ensure that they are also benefiting from these programs. And these programs will be really important, not only in helping driving down the cost of heat pumps, but also in stimulating the supporting ecosystem for this technology. On the topic of cost, I'll just highlight that we have done quite a bit of analysis on the economics of electrifying buildings and published one of the first reports on the topic a couple of years ago, and are looking to update this report and include more cities, including some in Minnesota, at the end of this year. But generally what we see is exclusively when you think about economic cost and not talking about health and emission cost, what you see is that new construction is often cheaper to do all electric buildings from the start rather than fossil fuels or gas. And the reason you see those lower costs is because you avoid the cost of gas infrastructure, and you avoid having to pay for two separate systems, one for heating and one for cooling. You also see cost savings when comparing retrofits to electric resistance and delivered fuels, away from those and towards heat pump technology. And when thinking about gas retrofits to heat pumps, sometimes those can be cost effective if there's a way to avoid gas infrastructure cost. And this, of course, goes without saying, but there are real health and emissions costs involved in continuing to evolve the fossil fuel infrastructure. And so if these externalized costs can be used to support these investments, as is being done in some states, this can further incentivize resources for heat pump deployment. So lastly, I'll wrap up talking briefly about some areas of increasing interest on the topic of building electrification. The first of those is around heat pumps in cold climates, which I know is especially a important issue in Minnesota. So spend a little bit of time on it. I'll start by saying that heat pump technology has improved significantly over the last couple of years. And modern heat pumps can work even in below freezing temperatures. And we expect that this technology will continue to improve and continue to be able to provide affordable and reliable heat in more and more extreme climates. What we've seen across the country is that in some retrofit programs, installers are leaving existing fossil fuel infrastructure to be used as backup heating, and in other places, they're relying on electric resistance, such as a ducted resistance backup, as a way to meet any deltas in what the heat pump can provide and the heating needs of the home. Some people bring up the concern over winter peaking, and I think this is, from an engineer's perspective, a very interesting issue. In a highly electrified future, this could be a problem in some areas, especially in cold climates. But this really won't be a problem until there is a very high penetration of heat pump deployment in a particular area. Some key mitigating strategies when this does begin to become a problem is weatherization and demand response programs. Another area where we're seeing a lot of focus and attention is on the health impacts of burning fossil fuels in buildings. Unsurprisingly, burning fossil fuels in buildings has health impacts. And something surprising, at least for me, when I started thinking about this issue, is that this is especially a problem in indoor air quality because indoor air is currently unregulated in the United States. And even before the pandemic, we spend up to 90% of our time indoors, which means that we are spending most of our time in unregulated air quality. The EPA states that these indoor pollutants may be 2 to 5 to sometimes as much as 100 times higher indoors than outdoors. So that means that you have levels of pollution inside your home that would be illegal outside your home. And we see sources, especially gas stoves, as a major contributor to these indoor pollutants. A gas stove, which we recently published a report, which I've linked here in this slide, can sometimes lead to 50 to 400% higher levels of NO2, which is a key trigger for asthma in homes with gas stoves when compared to electric stoves. So this is an area where we're seeing a lot of interest in, and where regulators throughout the country are thinking about how to use health funding in order to support the electrification of some buildings. And last and very importantly is that when thinking about building electrification, there's some serious equitable transition considerations that must be taken into account. I'll highlight two. The first is workforce transition, and the second is ensuring that low-income customers are protected. So of course, and this is a very real issue, is that there is a workforce that currently depends on selling fossils, and the estimates are that transitioning to a low carbon future will create lots of high quality jobs, but we still need cities and states to create these workforce training programs to allow for that. There also is a concern that low-income customers that can't immediately afford this transition will be burdened by the fixed costs of the system as wealthier customers defect. What we've seen a lot of states do to try to address this is to prioritize the transition of these low-income customers first. in the transition to all electric buildings. So these are real concerns, and people are actively working to address them. So with that, I'm sure you have plenty of questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can hear some of them.
Awesome, thanks, Sophia. Yeah, we do have some questions. I'll ask the first one here, and I'm also gonna just chat out a comment from one of the attendees too, so everyone can read the comments about Minnesota's Air Source Heat Pump Collaborative. So the first question is, if you had a little time, could you talk about how a heat pump can deliver 2 to 4 times more heat energy than the electricity it consumes?
Yeah, happy to. So I'll just rely on my overall description that a heat pump, really what it's doing is moving heat between your house or your building and the outside air. So rather than generating electricity. And so and it does this very similarly to what your refrigerator does, kind of the opposite of what your refrigerator does when you're providing heat to your house. And so what it does is that it aggregates heat from outside sources and concentrates it for use inside your house. So it's not magic, and it doesn't defy laws of thermodynamics, but rather it uses refrigeration and concentrating and moving heat from outside your house into your house. Hopefully that answers your questions, but I'm happy to share some maybe better explainers that are available online.
Sure, thanks. All right, the next question was, could you speak to the increased cost to operate electric systems versus natural gas? How are people overcoming this?
The increased operational cost?
Yes, that's the question.
Yeah, I would say of course it depends in every state and what the electricity rates and what the delivered gas rates are. But in a lot of states, what we see is that if you pair building electrification with other decarbonization solutions like solar, the operational cost can be much lower. And so it's definitely not the case that electric heat pumps are always more expensive operationally than gas. But some things that different utilities are considering in order to better incentivize building electrification is to consider time of use rates, change current demand charges in order to make electricity consumption through heat pumps more affordable to more people.
Another question: if we are to embark on a large-scale heat pump retrofit program, as well as banning gas in new construction, what do we need to know? What do we need to do now to build the workforce and manufacturing infrastructure to support this effort?
That's a great question. A lot of heat pump programs that have been really successful have directly partnered with heat pump manufacturers to think about some of these issues. In Maine, for example, heat pump manufacturers provide workforce training for people interested in working in this space. So I would say relying strongly on manufacturers could be a low cost way to help support this transition. Another thing that we've seen deployed successfully over the last couple of months, when obviously in-person training is really challenging, We've seen a resurgence in virtual training for workforce development. So another consideration can be some sort of hybrid system in which you use existing virtual training programs and then pair that with in-person training when that's available.
Got a few more minutes and two more minutes here and a few more questions. So could you talk about how low-income households would be shouldering increased costs if they are not prioritized in transitioning to electric technologies?
Yeah, happy to. It's a very it's a problem that scares a lot of people. So when we deploy gas or fossil fuel assets, often what we're doing is investing in fossil fuel infrastructure through pipes, for example, when you think about gas infrastructure. Now, to maintain or pay off this infrastructure, that requires a set of fixed costs that really don't depend on how many consumers are consuming gas. So you could imagine a scenario in which more and more customers are defecting from the gas grid or the fossil fuel infrastructure, and those fixed costs are going to have to be paid for by an increasingly smaller number of customers. So that's what a lot of people talk about when they worry about low-income households shouldering these increased costs. And which is why prioritizing these customers first is so critical, so that we can ensure that they're not responsible for these fixed costs. What we see in some places that regulators are taking a very active approach in thinking through this issue of what is called a stranded asset, and are actively planning for how to deal with these stranded assets in a way that doesn't burden the consumer class.
Okay, I'll squeeze one more question in here. Could you share your knowledge on hydrogens used in decarbonization? Is this a replacement fuel in buildings?
Yeah, excellent question. So when I talked about renewable natural gas, and I said that it was both biogas and synthetic gas, within synthetic gas, I lumped both the production of methane and the production of hydrogen. These are really exciting and emerging technologies that we should leverage to its fullest potential. However, it will only make up a very small portion of current U.S. Gas demand. And as a result, we should prioritize those resources to the sectors that we don't have viable alternatives for. So that those are alternatives those are sectors like heavy industry, where there isn't already a commercially ready low carbon alternative. And so yeah, just to summarize, hydrogen is exciting, it exists, but we should prioritize it in the sectors that will be hard to decarbonize because it will be very expensive.
All right, thank you. Thanks everyone for submitting questions. Those were excellent. I'm gonna pass the presenter role over to Samantha.
Great, thank you. Camera on here and I'll share. Okay, so everyone see, look at these to the top here.
Yep, we're seeing the PowerPoint.
All right.
And the presentation, great.
Awesome, great, thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Samantha Caputo. I am the Senior Policy and Research Associate at NEEP. NEEP is one of the 6 regional energy efficiency organizations. So Minnesota is a part of MEA, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with them, but just wanted to highlight that. So NEEP covers the area between Maine down to DC and West Virginia. And our mission is to help the region achieve carbon reduction and energy savings targets by 2030. So I think Anna and Sophia provided a great baseline and fundamentals of really what's happening across the country. And so I'm going to dive in and focus more on the Northeast and what we're seeing here. Just to kick that off, we've already touched on this a bit, but when we're looking at building decarbonization, which includes electrification, we're really looking at three different key elements to that. So one is deploying advanced electric technologies, and this is really where electrification comes in, but pairing that with deep energy efficiency, so ensuring that when you're electrifying end uses within a building, that you're doing the thermal improvements that need to go along with that to either air seal or just make sure that that home or building is thermally efficient to maintain the heat and cooling within that building. And then another critical component is also grid integration. So as we see the electric grid becoming more powered by low carbon electricity, seeing buildings actually work as a function within the grid, so two-way communication, buildings as grid assets. This is something that's definitely starting to
Sam, I think we lost your audio. Got the little triangle of low bandwidth.
Usually focusing on air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, and then also solar thermal technology. When looking to really push for strategic electrification, there are a lot of different policies and programs that we'll see come into play. And I'm going to touch on some examples of these across a few states in the Northeast, but I did just want to highlight one resource that may be helpful for Minnesota as you're working on this report, and that is NEEP's Building Decarbonization Public Policy Framework. And what this does is look at a lot of the key policy areas that need to either advance or change to ensure decarbonization. So looking at things that already exist, such as like building codes and standards, and how do we take those existing codes and drive them towards either zero carbon or all electric? How do we take utility programs and really push for electrification within that realm? So pretty high level and touching upon all the different types of policies that interact with buildings and providing that framework of how to move it forward. So that is available for you all to take a look at as well. So kind of diving right into it, I wanted to provide a few examples of different policies and also things on the regulatory level that are the states in the Northeast. And I'll just preface this that there are definitely states that are more active than others in the region. So I don't have something for every state in the Northeast, but there are some clear leaders in the space, such as New York and Massachusetts. So you hear about those two states. So in New York, one thing that is really setting the groundwork is a recent bill that was passed, enacted last year in 2019, and this is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And what this does is it actually sets New York to be the first state to look towards achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 by doing that with 85% greenhouse gas reduction and then carbon capture as the remaining 15%. And looking at increasing the level of renewable energy on the grid, mandating 70% by 2040. And then also requiring that 35% of the benefits go to underserved communities throughout New York State. And I highlight this legislation because I think it brings together some of those key elements that we want to see together to really set the policy platform for electrification by having a climate council that will help identify the key decarbonization strategies similar to the process that you all are going through right now. It can really bring out how electrification can achieve carbon neutrality, but then also the role for emissions efficiency is a key term that is growing in the Northeast as a term to look at the emissions level of electrified technology now, and then how that emissions changes over the lifetime of that technology, and seeing how the efficiency continues to increase. So when you put an air source heat pump in now, for instance, you have a particular grid integration of renewables, natural gas, other energy resources. And then as you get closer to some of these targets, such as 70% renewable electricity by 2040, that emissions efficiency of the technology increases significantly and the emissions will go down. So that is one kind of policy platform that can really help enable electrification and make the case for it as far as cost effectiveness. And so another alternative is looking through utility regulation and really getting utility programs and their business models to align with energy efficiency, economic and carbon benefits. So carbon, I think, is something new for a lot of utilities to be considering and valuing within their program design, within rate design, and a lot of those key elements. So by shifting those obligations to include carbon, as well as economic and efficiency benefits, you can really incentivize that utility to provide program design that will benefit their customers in a way that reduces carbon. So one place that we were seeing this is actually in Massachusetts. So back in 2018, the Act to Advance Clean Energy was passed. And this really broadened the energy efficiency program scope for the 3-year plans to include overall energy use. So this is basically going from having your traditional energy, electric and gas savings targets, so your kWh and your therm targets for the 3-year plans, to also including an MMBTU target that looks at overall energy use across programs. And what that does is really enable strategic electrification programs to be included. So if you're, and we see this as an important step for efficiency programs, because as we're electrifying and converting end uses powered by gas or fuel oil and propane to electric, you're essentially adding more demand onto the grid and increasing the energy use. So by looking at the overall energy use and MMBTU reduction, you will capture that energy savings, emissions reduction by going from especially oil and propane to electric. This also enabled active demand management to be included in programs. So thinking smart thermostats, advanced metering, and different technologies that can really help the consumer actively manage that energy consumption, and in some cases the utility doing it on behalf of the consumer. And then it also brought cost effectiveness up to the sector level. And this was previously more measure level. And I think that it's important to highlight this, because when you look at sector level or program level of cost effectiveness, you can have particular measures in there that may not be as cost effective as others, but if the overall program is cost effective, then it can move forward. So that's another piece of this legislation. And then the current 3-year plan in Massachusetts includes the fuel neutral goal. It has carbon reduction included in the cost effectiveness testing, and looking at those resource specific goals. So we're seeing this in action right now in Massachusetts. The other option, looking at regulatory proceedings, and this is something Sophia touched on as well. And I did want to highlight one place that we're seeing this, where you're seeing utilities investigate how electrification could work for their utility business model. And in Rhode Island, there was the Power Sector Transformation Initiative, and this was an investigation similar, I think, to this proceeding. Currently, Minnesota is looking at how does electrification work for the utility programs. what needs to change within the utility business model to enable electrification, what does distribution system planning look like, and then also grid connectivity. So it really encompasses a lot of those key strategies that together can help decarbonize the building sector. And I linked the report for you all as well if you're interested in seeing that. And then in further, and continuing on with what we're seeing on utility proceedings, I did also want to highlight two different proceedings that are going on right now that are really, I mean, these are brand new proceedings this summer. One is in New York, and this is something that a lot of advocates and stakeholders in the state of New York were really pushing for a long time. It was a proceeding on gas planning. And so really, the aim of this is to provide transparency in the state for how gas planning can meet and support customer needs, how it can be used to help meet emissions objectives and minimize infrastructure investment. So it's looking at really what it will do is look at the transition of gas within the state of New York, but making sure that through that transition that it's transparent for everyone and also meeting the needs of existing customers and ensuring that infrastructure is reliable, that exists already, that there's adequate service and things like that. And I think it's one of the questions and challenges that actually came up in the Q&A during Sophia's presentation was looking at low-income households and really the need to ensure that they're not left behind in this transition. And I think this proceeding will definitely investigate that, because it is absolutely true when you think about the upfront cost of fuel switching to air source heat pumps. It can be a capital investment, especially if there aren't existing rebates or incentives that make it more cost effective. It may be more accessible to someone who is not within the low income customer class. So making sure that there are programs in place that will help within that transition to make sure that you're serving all customers in an equitable way, I think is definitely critical. And then the other one is in Massachusetts. This is actually a petition from the Attorney General's office to the Department of Public Utilities to look at the impact of continuing gas operations within the state, and then also how that could impact the state achieving its 2050 climate goals. And I'm not sure if folks on the line are as familiar, but 2 years ago, there were some very large and catastrophic gas explosions in Massachusetts up near the Lowell Lawrence area. And so there has been a lot of investigation into the causes of that, the health and safety of gas within the state as repercussions of that explosion. And this petition is definitely directly related to that as well, as how can we ensure health and safety, how does continuing gas within the state meet the state's climate goals. And so through both of these proceedings, there'll be opportunities to evaluate some of the cost effectiveness of fuel switching and what that transition looks like to an electrified, decarbonized future. And then just to highlight some programs across the region, we have a lot going on, particularly in the New England area for especially heat pump and electrification programs. So from Maine last year set a goal to have 100,000 heat pumps deployed by 2025. So really exciting to see that. We're seeing air source heat pumps being included within renewable portfolio standards, either as an alternative portfolio standard or within the RPS themselves. So that would be Massachusetts as well as New Hampshire. And also seeing a lot of different programs. And I think Sophia had a similar map that was showing how there are actual air source heat pump programs being deployed, particularly highlighting that it was in cold climates that we're seeing that, and with a high focus on how this technology can be deployed with cold climates in place. So lots of activity happening here. And I will highlight one in particular is in Connecticut. There are heat pump rebates that are offered through the Energize Connecticut program, which is where the 3-year efficiency program lives. And they actually use RGGI funding, so the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, to incentivize fuel switching from oil and propane to electric, because they cannot use ratepayer funds that come from electric and gas bills to incentivize someone from delivered fuel to electric. So using the RGGI funding from that cap and trade program is an alternative funding mechanism that the state of Connecticut has leveraged to really incentivize that fuel switching program. And just to keep things moving along here, I did want to highlight a few challenges, and these are really challenges that come up across the region. And one is the amortization rates for rate cases between electric and gas. And we're seeing this because a lot of gas prices throughout the Northeast are very low. So it's very affordable for folks to be on gas distribution for heating, and getting them to switch to an electric technology difficult. And part of this is because of the amortization rates. We see a lot of rates within the 60 to 80 years. And basically what that is doing is saying the gas distribution assets, the repayment of that asset is over the lifetime of it, going up to 80 years. And this is definitely a challenge because the electric amortization rates are usually more than like the 20 to 30 years, which increases the cost within the rate cases. So this is definitely something that a lot of folks are starting to focus on in the Northeast, is how do we change this? And definitely recognizing that having amortization rate of up to 80 years goes well beyond our decarbonization timeline of trying to achieve significant greenhouse gas reductions by 2050. That puts us more at the 30-year mark at this point for amortization. So this is a challenge throughout the region. It's something that's coming up in New Jersey, particularly as the utilities are putting together their first 3-year plan under their energy efficiency resource standard, and looking at how electrification could play into it. And so lots of conversations happening here around that. And then the other challenge is cold climates. So Sophia highlighted how there are lots of programs across the country for air source heat pumps, particularly highlighting cold climates. And I think because this is where you really need to get customer buy-in, is really showing how does an air source heat pump heat my home in the middle of the winter? And this question that everyone's going to ask. So having the resources available, and I did share a buyer guide in the chat already that can help answer a lot of questions consumers may have about air source heat pumps and finding the right one for them. And I'll also note that NEEP has a air source heat pump technology list where we're looking at the efficiency of the different technologies, how they work in cold climates, the cost of the technology. And this is leveraged by a lot of states across the Northeast and beyond to really help identify which technology utility should be promoting within their programs. And I do think that there's opportunity to really push for electrification, looking at the natural depreciation of assets. So as homeowners are looking to upgrade their gas infrastructure or their oil propane furnaces or whatever it is that they may have, knowing that that's coming and having the reference materials for them, and having qualified, I think, contractors that can help push them towards electrifying is definitely really important. So that speaks to, again, the question earlier about building our workforce to support electrification is definitely really important. I think looking towards trade schools and really having those types of programs in place, trade schools, community colleges, other things like that, and really identifying where we can pull people in early on in their careers into this. And I know I'm running low on time, so just quickly wanted to highlight this table on encouraging electrification. So different ways to do that through utility programs, looking at ratepayer programs, performance-based design rates, so performance incentive mechanisms, looking at asset utilization, grid modernization, and benefit cost testing. And this is all really highlighted throughout that public policy framework I identified in the beginning of the presentation. So I won't spend more time here, but that's definitely an available resource. But I did quickly want to just note the role of cost effectiveness. As many of you may have seen, the National Standard Practice Manual came out with its second version, focusing on distributed energy resources. And this actually includes a whole chapter on electrification and how to do cost effectiveness testing for electrification as a distributed energy resource. So this is definitely an option for looking at the cost effectiveness test within the state to make sure it's aligning with public policy goals and creating a test that really works for the state of Minnesota in achieving your policy goals and valuing electrification within that. And the last piece here, and Sophia also touched on this, but to help drive electrification within existing buildings, building performance standards are a really great resource and something that's popping up more, I think, at the city level right now, where we're seeing cities requiring large buildings to meet certain performance requirements, looking at either energy use as a metric or some looking at carbon emissions as their metric, and both have lots of benefits to them, but to really drive electrification as a pathway within performance standards, looking at the carbon emissions is a really great way to drive away from fossil fuel energy resources. And we're seeing this in the Northeast. New York City was the first one, well, actually, DC was the first one to pass a building performance standard, and they use an energy use intensity framework for theirs and scale down the square footage size of buildings that are required to comply with this every 3 years, I believe. And then New York City also passed one that's looking at emissions as their primary metric and looking at the 50,000 largest buildings across the city. Boston and Cambridge are also indicated their interest in developing these. They already have the benchmarking policies in place to do that. So really exciting to see how these play out and how electrification plays a role. With that, I'll pause and take some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Excellent. And thanks everyone for submitting questions. Colin is going to chat out a couple links that have been shared with people to resources again, so that's right at the top of your feed. One question, is there a larger benefit to move commercial buildings to use heat pumps than residential buildings?
That's a really good question. I think it can be built in more cost effectively on the commercial side when you're looking at the overall project cost. And I know geothermal particularly has grown in interest as a resource for electrifying on the commercial side. But I think I definitely share some of our resources that we have that look at this to answer that question more closely. And any really particular like air source heat pump questions that get really into the details, I'm happy to answer them the best I can. But my colleagues, Dave Liss and Derek Kadakshian, are the two air source heat pump experts at NEEP. And I'm happy to connect anyone with them as well to answer some more technical and in the weeds questions that might come up.
Sounds good. So second question here, why are electrification measures so frequently promoted through electric utility efficiency programs? There are no electric savings associated with them. Why should all electric customers pay for load building?
That's a really, really great question. And I think it's coming up a lot as far as like how to actually pay for incentivizing switching to electric technology when those customers are not paying into those ratepayer funds. I think this is where the example like Connecticut that's leveraging on other funding revenue sources that go into the efficiency programs as a way to help incentivize that by using the RGGI funding. And I know that obviously is not a funding base available in all states. It's mostly Northeast, but I think identifying if there are other revenue bases or public-private partnerships and things like green banks and those other types of funding opportunities to really help push this is important, because it is very difficult to say that you're going to have electric ratepayers pay for an increased surge on the grid by bringing new electric technology onto it. But I do think that when you see the utility business model starting to shift and really look at carbon within those programs, and it's definitely easier when you have a utility that's both electric and gas versus when you have two different utilities supplying that energy to the customers. It gets more challenging in that instance because then that utility is losing customers to the other resource there. And so I think it's definitely a question that a lot of stakeholders are still kind of weeding out, but identifying ways to help address it, such as looking at the overall energy savings and not just the electric savings, is one way that we're starting to see utilities address it in the Northeast by having that all fuel savings target. And when the utilities have a joint plan for achieving that target, and then they're showing the ways that it kind of breaks down based on the level of service that each one provides, you can see how that transition can start to happen. But it's definitely, I think that there's no clear answer yet, but there are things in motion to help address it at the moment. If that, I think, if that answer the question well?
Yeah, thank you. So, another question, in the Northeast, how are customers dealing with heat pump and issue reliability of only 15 degrees below?
Yeah, so like I said, so NEEP has a resource list of different heat pump technologies. And one of the key things that we look at when looking at cold climate air source heat pumps is the temperature at which they can perform their capacity to. And I had actually asked one of my colleagues a question about this, that when it is used in a cold climate, the different technologies that we include in our list, they actually have an average efficiency for about 200 to 250% within the cold climate. So we are particularly looking at technologies that can provide heating to customers within the extreme cold climate, because we do have that, particularly up in Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, those states. And I think one thing that we're seeing some customers do because of concerns about that and ensuring that they are getting heat when they need it throughout the winter is we do have a trend where some are not fully converting. So they'll have their air source heat pump as their primary heating technology, but then they may still keep their gas connection as a backup fuel, or they'll still keep their oil tank and have it as backup. And that's definitely not a trend that we want to see promoted, I guess, if we want to see the full transition away from those delivered fuels. But it is something I think in the early stages of getting market buy-in, consumer buy-in, is having that kind of like safety net in the back is helping a little bit.
I'll squeeze one last question in. When assessing the costs of beneficial electrification, are the costs to remove or terminate the prior natural gas infrastructure, example, capping lines, being considered? If so, how are those costs being factored into electrification programs?
That's a great question. So when looking at cost effectiveness, and I think that this is one of the principles of the National Standard Practice Manual, is to not include the cost of stranded assets when looking at cost effectiveness of pushing, not even just electrification, but just all distributed energy resources and energy efficiency, cost effectiveness testing. The principle is to have it forward looking and to not include stranded assets. So I think that is going to be critical going forward when looking at cost effectiveness programs of electrification and leaving those stranded asset costs out of it going forward.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, I will now pass presenter control over to Jessica for our final presentation.
Sure, let me just get this up here. Can everyone hear me okay?
You're just a little faint, but we can hear you, yep.
Oh yeah, is that any better?
That's better, thank you.
Okay, let me just share this. So hi everyone, I'm Jessica Allison. I'm a senior energy analyst for the California Public Utilities Commission. Today I'm going to be talking about some of the fuel substitution activities we're undertaking in California, including a 2019 decision which addressed some policy issues around fuel substitution to allow it in the energy efficiency portfolio. And I'm also going to provide some examples of fuel substitution activities which are currently being undertaken. So just for the sake of time, I'm not going to walk through this entire agenda now, but if you want to take a look at what's coming up, I'm going to talk about the fuel substitution decision and then some policy background. I'm going to give an overview of what our fuel substitution policies are in California using ratepayer funding, and then discuss some current activities and lessons learned from this process. So in the context of energy efficiency, fuel substitution is defined as activities which replace an end use utilizing one regulated fuel with a similar end use utilizing a different regulated fuel. This is a similar definition to what some of the other presenters have discussed, but something that I wanted to highlight here is that this is really only focusing in California on regulated fuels. So the energy efficiency branch of the California Public Utilities Commission oversees utility incentive programs. So we're going to be talking about when they provide ratepayers incentives to go from either natural gas to electricity or vice versa. We do not regulate things like wood or propane, and therefore these policies only cover the natural gas to electric switch or vice versa, and doesn't provide incentives for customers who are currently using wood and propane. So the 2019 fuel substitution decision was notable because there was a general perception among stakeholders that fuel substitution activities are important to California's energy efficiency goals and energy goals generally. To set the stage a little bit for why fuel substitution matters in California and why we underwent the very challenging process of bringing stakeholders together and allowing it in our portfolio, I've pulled together 4 key facts that sort of set the stage for this. Firstly, approximately 25% of the GHG emissions come from buildings in California. Obviously, sectors like transportation play a huge role in GHG emissions and reducing them, but a good chunk of emissions are still associated with our buildings. This leads to the second fact, which is that California has a vested interest in decarbonizing the building sector. AB 3232 required an assessment of how to reduce carbon build in the building sector to below 1990 levels by 40%. And then thirdly, a study from UC Berkeley and then other similar studies have been conducted as well, found that 90% of the water heaters in California currently utilize natural gas. So one way we could choose to achieve our building decarbonization goals would be to focus on replacing those older natural gas water heaters with more efficient gas water heaters. But in California, the electric grid is far less GHG intensive than our gas grid. So replacing them instead with electric alternatives could be a good option for achieving our goals. Prior to the 2019 fuel substitution decision, incentivizing fuel substitution was practically impossible, but not technically impossible. The old fuel substitution policies were very strict and basically no measures were able to pass the tests. In 2019, the energy efficiency budget was approximately $800 million. So this is the last important fact I want to bring up, that after the 2019 fuel substitution decision, that $800 million was accessible to fuel substitution programs, which was seen as a big step towards achieving our greenhouse gas emission goals. So to give a quick background on the decision and the policies that went into making it, the Commission developed policies on fuel substitution as early as 1990. This was obviously a big step at the time. During this decision process, it was created at a time where our electric grid was more carbon intensive and energy efficiency programs were still maturing. The bulk of the stakeholders were very concerned about the possibility of fuel wars between electric and gas only utilities. And when I say fuel war, I mean there was concerns about utilities predatorily seeking to increase load of the fuel they offer rather than undertaking fuel substitution programs in the spirit of reducing energy consumption generally. The original fuel substitution decision established the three-prong test, which technically allowed fuel substitution activities, but as I said before, the requirements were so strict that practically none were incentivized. As time passed and our electrical grid became more efficient, solar generation increased and the energy efficiency market kind of sucked up all of the low-hanging fruit like lighting. The state passed goals related to GHG reductions, and stakeholders began to see electrification as a primary tool for achieving our state goals. Finally, the NRDC, Sierra Club, and SEDMEC filed a motion with the CPUC to review the three-prong test in 2017. Between 2017 and 2019, the judges sought comments on the motion. We released a proposed decision, and then we received comments on the proposed decision. And then finally, in August of 2019, the Commission passed the new fuel substitution decision. The decision also directed Energy Division, that's the division for which I work, to produce a technical guidance document which walks stakeholders through all of the practical elements of passing the tests, and then also fleshed out some specific guidances related to cost effectiveness analyses and reporting requirements. In this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on passing the test and then providing some examples of programs, but I'd be happy to answer questions related to reporting or cost effectiveness analyses as well. So in this next portion of the presentation, I'm just going to go through the elements of the test and some of the math that we use to ensure that fuel substitution policies are for the benefit of Californians rather than have any kind of load building character. So our fuel substitution test has two parts. The first part of the test states that measures must not increase source energy. I'll provide an explanation of what site and source energy is for those that need a refresher on the next slide. The second part of the test states that the measure must not increase GHG emissions. The decision said that we would use CO2 equivalent GHG emissions as a proxy for environmental harm, which is the important chunk of the second test. Both parts of the test are evaluated at measure level, which means that each fuel substitution technology has to pass the test individually for the climate zone in which it's offered before it can be included and incentivized in the energy efficiency portfolio generally. You'll notice that there are only two parts of the fuel substitution test and neither address cost effectiveness. This is because the fuel substitution measures are evaluated for cost effectiveness as part of our general energy efficiency portfolio assessments and are not required to be cost effective individually. This is actually a departure from the original fuel substitution decision that was passed in the 1990s for those that are familiar with California policy. And then finally, I think it's really important to note that our policies regarding fuel substitution are fuel neutral. They're not designed to encourage customers to transition from natural gas to electricity, technically. Rather, we've developed these policies with the goal of reducing GHG emissions generally, regardless of what fuel is being replaced. For the sake of transparency, I do want to say, though, that we currently don't have any programs that are switching customers from electricity to natural gas because the utilities have not offered electric to natural gas replacement measure that's able to pass the fuel substitution test. So this slide gives an overview of the site versus source energy. Basically the difference is the source energy describes all of the energy consumption involved with producing the energy and then delivering it to the building for it then to be consumed by the customer. Meanwhile, site energy is simply the kWh and therms that are used by the customer in their building. So in California, practically all of our electricity is generated through natural gas powered turbines or through renewables. So therefore, in California, our source energy calculations start at the power plant phase, but for those states that are still using coal for electric production, their source energy calculations would begin at the coal mine. So it's important, I think, when considering fuel substitution policies to consider what that source energy calculation is compared to the site energy. So in terms of actually passing the test, I'm going to discuss the process for demonstrating the measures passed. We developed an Excel-based tool to help the program administrators with these calculations, but I'll run through them conceptually here. The program administrators essentially provide a copy of the calculator results when they're asking the CPC to improve inclusion in our portfolio. So as I mentioned before, part 1 of the test states that the measures must not increase source energy. That means that the life cycle source energy of a measure must be lower than the life cycle source energy of the technology. This calculation is done in our fuel substitution calculator. But essentially the steps for this is that you convert the site energy savings to source energy savings using intensity factors that we developed for this effort. You repeat that process for all of the years in the measure expected useful life and then sum it. And then if the BTU results are positive, that indicates that there are savings. And interestingly, the second part of the test has a very similar calculation. As I mentioned before, California's non-renewable electric generation is done pretty much entirely with gas. Because of this, after we finished developing the process, we determined that the energy intensity factors are essentially the same for part 1 and part 2, even though the results are expressed a little bit differently. So in the second part of the test, you perform the site energy to CO2 conversion for each year of the measure EUL and then add it together. And as I said, if the emission values are positive, it passes the test. I'm just trying to advance. Here we go. So this is the actual formula for this. We released a technical guidance document which provides a very in-depth explanation of all of the math on this slide for those that are interested, but I'm just going to quickly run through it to give us an idea of the calculations. So to calculate the source energy, we subtract the measure site energy electric consumption from the baseline site electric energy consumption for the first year. We multiply that value by the yearly energy intensity factors that are developed for this process, which I'll show you on the next slide. We perform that calculation for every year of the measure's expected useful life. Since the gas portion of the equation uses relatively constant energy intensity values, we add the gas portion separately. So in order to do that, we subtract the measure gas usage from the baseline gas usage, multiply that value by the source energy value for the natural gas, which, as I said, is constant, and then that value multiplied by the measure expected useful life. If the overall result of this equation is positive, the measure achieved source energy savings and passes part 1 of our test. So these are the energy intensity factors that I discussed in the previous slide, and they're an input to the equation. We assume that there are no source energy, there's no source energy used from non-emitting and non-depletable renewable resources like solar and wind. Simply put, these factors were developed by dividing the CAISO maximum allowable emissions for each year by the forecasted total retail sales expectations for the electric sector in the same year. We had to perform a much more complicated calculation to extend the values past 2030, but that process is described in greater detail in the technical guidance document for those who are interested. So in terms of some challenges and lessons learned from this, I think most stakeholders would agree that this was a very challenging process. It was challenging in the decision development and in implementation. It was much more controversial than traditional energy efficiency activities, as I'm sure many stakeholders on this call are familiar with. One pain point with this process was deciding like what type of measures should be incentivized and under what conditions. We received some feedback that stakeholders were interested in engaging in activities which switch from propane and wood, but since the CPUC doesn't regulate propane and wood, we ultimately decided that we weren't able to incentivize these programs. Additionally, there was some controversy over whether we should consider new construction activities, and we ultimately decided that the building electrification in the new construction space would need to be incentivized through other proceedings. We have a building decarbonization proceeding that's designed to cover this. So as with all energy efficiency, we had some challenges balancing energy savings with the need to be cost effective. Our old policies required cost effectiveness at the measure level, and the 2019 decision decided to remove that barrier and assess fuel substitution measures along with the entire portfolio. And then finally, another challenge was just fitting fuel substitution into our existing goal setting process. We set goals for kilowatt hours and therms, But for fuel substitution, it was challenging to make that work because we have single fuel utilities that didn't receive gas savings goals. So we needed to use conversion factors to ensure that they got credit for the fuel substitution activities that they ran, even though they didn't receive goals in the therm metric. So turning to which measures are actually offered in California, here's a list of our approved technologies. I'm not going to read through all of them, but I'll just say that the primary technologies that are currently being incentivized are the heat pump water heaters and the heat pump HVAC systems. We also have heat cooking in the residential and commercial space as well. So here are some cost effectiveness forecasts for heat pump water heaters. We're still waiting for the program results as the programs began running in 2020, but these are the estimates for the cost benefit ratios. I show 3 different types of heat pumps, or 3 different sizes of heat pumps in 3 different climate zones, so you can get a sense of the variability of the benefit cost ratio. So for the small sized water heater in climate zone 8, which is the Central Valley, there's a cost benefit ratio of 1.63. If you look at that same unit in a different climate zone 13, which is the Southern California and the inland, it falls to 1.47. So that's still a pretty good TRC. But if you go to the larger size and the medium size heat pump, you see that it has a really detrimental impact on cost effectiveness. So in climate 8, which is the Central Valley, the mid-sized heat pump has a benefit cost ratio of only 0.48. So this demonstrates that the types of inputs that you use in the cost effectiveness calculations can have a really big impact on the cost benefit ratios. So as I mentioned before, the cost effectiveness of measures vary greatly by climate zones. This was one of the major findings for us. Heat pumps do not perform as well in cold climates, and that's definitely reflected in our cost effectiveness calculations. That's not to say that they're not offered in the colder parts of California, but we do see that there's a need for some program design when looking at offering heat pumps and other fuel substitution technologies in a state that has a pretty big range of climates, though obviously it doesn't get to be -16 here in California in any part for the most part. In California, the program administrators have the option to exclude or include upgrade costs such as electric panel upgrades. If those costs are included, the measures obviously tend to be much less cost effective. In the examples I showed you previously, that was not including any infrastructure upgrades like the necessity of panels, or even things like just installing the heat pump in a space that was not designed for a heat pump. That was another finding. Other equipment specifications like the baselines, the energy ratings, and the water heater size also greatly impact cost effectiveness results. So the reason I highlight this is for program administrators who are looking to include these types of technologies, I think it's important to try different variations, because something that seems that like it won't be cost effective if you try in one area using one specifications might actually be cost effective in other areas with slightly different specifications. Another finding is that we've been focusing on upstream and midstream delivery. That means programs that offer incentives to manufacturers and retailers. We found that this was a much more cost-effective way to incentivize customers to install heat pumps, because there was a lot less program design issues with going into customers' homes and offering things like that. And then finally, we found that focusing on combining incentives can be a really helpful way to incentivize these technologies. So we look to combine rebates from other state programs like building decarbonization, and then also from local jurisdictions that have incentives available for heat pump technologies and other fuel substitution. So I'm happy to take questions now, and also for those that are interested in a little bit more information, I've included some links to the fuel substitution decision, which I referenced throughout the presentation, as well as our technical guidance document. That document goes into a pretty good level of detail about all of our calculations and our assumptions that go into those calculations. So that's a good resource to check out. And then finally, I've also included a link to our fuel substitution calculator, which is the technical tool tool that our stakeholders use to perform the calculations I walked through in this presentation.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So feel free to chat your questions for Jessica into the Q&A. I think we might have a few minutes after we give Jessica 10 minutes or so here to invite all our presenters back on for questions to everyone too. So if you want to specify a question to all presenters, you could do that as well. So with respect to utility cost effectiveness calculations, Jessica, this is the first question. Does it make sense to consider using avoided gas infrastructure in the benefits portion of the equation for all electric programs?
That actually is something that we've discussed quite a bit, and we're working on that with stakeholders now. So from my personal perspective, I would say that that definitely does make sense to at least consider those costs, because they can be really quite significant, especially for new construction where there's you can make a decision on whether to install the gas pipelines, and with all electric buildings, those costs can be avoided. And I feel like those are very real avoided costs, at least to the customer. It's maybe a little bit more arguable if those are avoided costs to the gas grid, because in connecting one building might not have grid level impacts, but I think that it should at least be considered, and that's a conversation that's still going on in California now.
Thank you. Next question. Has California just demonstrated that utilities, while aligning with efficiency, economic, and carbon goals, must also continue to align with reliability and duty to serve goals?
So I'm just trying to, so is the question, is the duty to serve and reliability still important? If that's the question, I would say it definitely is important. At least in California, we've long acknowledged that there is a role for the gas utilities going forward. We don't intend to electrify in such a way that it leaves customers stranded, and there are ongoing conversations about, as electrification gains ground, how to manage the aging gas infrastructure and how to support customers that still use gas. We are having conversations about renewable natural gas. That's a pretty early thing in California. We don't have a huge percent of gas delivered renewably at this point, but that it is an important conversation, and I think that it's reflected to some degree in our effort to make fuel substitution policies technology neutral.
Here's another question. When a single fuel utility converts the savings from another fuel, is the conversion done as a source equivalent savings or as a site equivalent? Was that a complicated policy issue that stakeholders had to resolve at some point?
Yes, it was a very complicated policy issue, and it was not without controversy. So for the purposes of goal attainment, the calculations are done at a site level. And that's true. That's so okay. For cost effectiveness, the cost effectiveness calculations are run through our calculator in the same way that they would be for all other technologies. But for the purposes of goal attainment, we use a site level conversion. But for the purposes of passing the fuel substitution test, we use source. So the first is like, is this benefiting the environment? And that's a source calculation. And if it passes that stage, from there we use site level calculations for the conversion for goal attainment purposes.
Can you expand a little more in terms of how the stakeholder input was taken during that process, and then how you came to your decision to use that methodology?
Yeah, so when we released a proposed decision, we had a framework for how we thought that this policy could work, and stakeholders had an opportunity to comment on the calculations, and there was some debate about what type of calculation it should be and the necessity of using a complex calculation versus the benefits of using a more simple calculation. And ultimately, we decided that the source was important to make sure it didn't harm the environment. But once you got to the goal attainment purposes, we balanced complicated calculations with or I should say, we tried to balance like an accuracy with a simplicity, and we ultimately went with a little bit more simple route just to keep things as transparent as possible when we're doing the goal attainment purposes. But there were stakeholder input taken at the decision phase, and then again quite a bit at the technical implementation phase. So once we actually started writing these calculations and producing the technical guidance document, we actually worked with a utility to develop it and some contractors, and we solicited more feedback from the utilities and other stakeholders during the implementation phase. So our I think our stakeholders had a pretty good opportunity to look at the calculations before they were finalized and provide feedback on them.
Thank you. Okay, another question. The largest barrier to adoption of electric technologies is the high rates of electricity that do not reflect the low cost of serving the electricity of those loads. I think I'm not quite sure that's electricity of those technologies. In California, have rates been changed to better reflect the cost to serve of electrification technologies?
So I'm not in the rate making group, but I know that we at the commission do spend quite a bit of time trying to ensure that the rates customers pay are fair and just. And to my knowledge, which I should admit that it's pretty limited, we haven't specifically adjusted rates in response to fuel substitution activities. I think that part of that is that this is a pretty new decision, and then I mean, I'm not sure what the intention is, but we do have special rates for high electric usage. So for example, if you have an EV, you can apply for a different rate for your electricity for that electric vehicle than the customer would pay just for their normal load expectations. And I believe that's also the case for all electric buildings and buildings that have a high degree of electrification. So we are looking at offering a little bit of rate relief to customers who are pursuing high electrification scenarios at their homes.
All right, so another question, do the electric intensity factors take into account time of use?
That was actually another big policy question that we had to answer. There was an intention to have hourly values reflected in these calculations, but when we actually went to determine how to perform those calculations, we realized that the people who would be performing the calculations, like the third-party implementers, didn't necessarily have access to the 8760 load shapes that they would need to make those calculations work. And when we spoke to our contractors about how to resolve this issue, we ultimately went in different direction with we call them long run energy intensity factors. So the idea behind these long run flat factors is they reflect grid behavior in the long run. And essentially it asks the question about if the electric sector experiences an increase in load, how will they meet that increased demand? And the assumption is not that they're going to build new gas turbines, because essentially our policies in California will ultimately prohibit them from meeting all electric demand with gas turbines, especially as electrification increases. So we look at how that will impact generation, and the technical guidance document goes into all of this logic in pretty good detail if you want to look there. But because we took this long run approach, we ultimately decided that we didn't need the hourly calculations, simply because it looks at the long run behavior. So when you're looking at behavior in a year out and 2 years out, doing those hourly calculations is just not necessary, because it suggests the cumulative impact rather than an hourly impact. But that was something that was debated pretty hotly, and I think there's a lot of merits to both approaches.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we might pull everyone in for a few questions. Are you or are any of the utilities in California combining demand response with an electrification measure?
That's actually something that we're looking at in our potential and goals study. I guess I'll just do a plug for the study. So when we're determining the goals for our utilities and the potential of energy efficiency, this year we are exploring options for combining demand response. We have some fairly robust demand response programs in California, and this new effort is essentially trying to combine those energy efficiency and demand response, which is particularly exciting for fuel substitution technologies, because targeting those off-peak hours makes these technologies like really very worthwhile, whereas letting them run unimpeded, as the last question implies, could end up with electric load increases during times of the day that we don't want to see that. So yeah, we are looking into that, and I'm excited to see what comes of that research.
Thank you. Okay. So yeah, let's add back in Samantha and Anna Sophia. Question here is, as the transition increases from gas to electric, what impacts have been considered for the subsequent transition of jobs from gas to electric, and what are the decisions surrounding this?
I'm happy to jump in. We have an example in Massachusetts. So there's the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and they do a lot of different training across energy efficiency, renewable energy, electrification, and they're actually looking at expanding training programs for working professionals that are a part of either delivered fuels or natural gas industry, and provide clear training pathways for them to be integrated into the clean energy workforce. So that's something that is being looked at in Massachusetts pretty closely to support the transition, and definitely identifying that there is a need to provide clear indicators to the workforce within delivered fuels and natural gas that there is an alternative pathway for them. And then I think it's also important to look at stakeholders getting into the industry. So like at all points in careers, so either graduating high school, in college, post-grad, later in your career, I think it is important to provide indicators and opportunities at all those stages. I think also recognizing that for the workforce that are in the second half of their career that are older, it may not be as appealing for them to transition at that point if they're 50 and above and getting closer towards retirement, but providing kind of like an indication or pathway for them either to stay within that industry and work on the transition from either the delivered fuel side or the gas side is also important to not make it seem like it's this or nothing. You won't have any job opportunity to support the end of your career. And then the last thing is we are seeing actually in the Northeast a growing trend where companies that do delivered fuels, particularly oil, that they're starting to offer other technologies like air source heat pumps, and they're recognizing that there is going to be a timeline and a transition away from this. It is happening, and trying to be a part of that and start offering alternatives to oil pretty early on. But it's definitely interesting when you see a company that's like, yeah, we can give you oil in your tank, or oh yeah, we have air source heat pump technology that we're offering. So we're seeing a bit of both.
So anyone else want to talk about workforce issues? Otherwise, I have another question here. Okay, so can anyone speak to the issues of resiliency of electrification in cold climates, especially during severe weather impacts and grid reliability?
I can get started. I have a feeling Samantha could add to what I have to say, but resilience is super important. I'll just start there. Prior to working on this issue, I worked for a couple years in Puerto Rico and saw firsthand the health impacts of not having reliable electricity, and so. As we transition to an electric future and extreme weather events become more and more frequent, this is definitely something that we have to plan for. And so I have a couple thoughts. The first is weatherization programs can be really effective, especially as you start thinking about extreme cold events. That should be considered is thinking about these issues more explicitly in utility resource planning, both in the gas and electric side. There are recommendations to potentially do a combined energy resource plan for both gas and electric utilities in order to better explore these issues of resilience and reliability. And then I'll just wrap up by saying that there are resilience considerations even with fossil fuel alternatives. These systems often rely on electric fans that also fail if there are grid outages. So I say this mostly to further emphasize that we don't want grid outages ever, whether the system is mostly reliant on electricity or has a mixed fuel use.
And I'm happy to just add in a quick note on that as well, because we definitely have seen the impacts of a lot of different extreme weather events in the Northeast, from hurricanes, tornadoes, and extreme snow in the winter. We actually call them bomb cyclones now. It's a weird name where these like massive, almost like snow tornado things happen. So definitely a lot happening to really bring up the importance of resilience. And I think when looking at electrification, it's really important to also look at how electrification within codes and standards can be used to help help construct and retrofit buildings so that they are resilient. And I think this is where the thermal efficiency aspect of it comes into play when you're adding electrified technology into homes and buildings, to make sure that they have deep thermal efficiency as well, to really help support if there is an outage and there's no backup generator or something like that, to support heating in that home, that it is built or retrofitted in a way that keeps that heat in for a long period of time. And I know that this is something that when you look at like Passive House and other of those certifications, that they do look at the resiliency aspect of it and how long those homes or buildings could maintain heat or cooling depending on the season if there were an outage that prevented heating and cooling technology to function.
Excellent. Well, thank you, three. I think we're at time here for questions. I have a couple slides for wrap up, but I did want to thank you all for your preparation, your comments today. It was really excellent. And thanks to all the attendees for questions. You made my life very easy as a moderator. I will take back the role as presenter here and then share a couple slides here as we wrap up. All right. Oh, and so I'm going to start a poll here. And this poll has open-ended questions. And you will have now until the end of the webinar, and I'll keep it open for 10 minutes after the webinar concludes as well. So you'll have until say 12:10 to respond if you want to take a little time to think about your answers. And then the link to the project website is right here. Shortly following the event, we'll be getting the recording of the webinar and the slides posted there. And then there is more information about the project as well. So you can access all those resources on the website. So heading out from today, our next phase of the project is the Technical Advisory Committee work. This group will be comprised of about 20 to 25 stakeholder organizations. We've had a good showing of volunteers, and the group makeup will be finalized shortly, including a few people who chatted to me today, interested in joining the group. The group will be meeting a number of times in the next few months to delve into some of the specific technical questions that surround electrification of the built environment in Minnesota. These questions are broadly grouped into 3 buckets: technologies, grid impacts, and metrics. And I think our presenters today have highlighted a number of the kind of facets of these 3 topics that we'll be looking at. This group will be asked to share the results of its work with stakeholders in early 2021. Our goal is to make the TAC accountable to this larger stakeholder group as an extension of this process. With that in mind, for the topics that the TAC takes up, they will be seeking to answer these 4 questions. 1, what should stakeholders understand about the topic? What needs more research and/or clarity? What are the policy implications? And does the TAC have any recommendations? As a point of clarification, recommendations from the TAC are not expected to be binding results, but rather conclusions that they feel comfortable making. And their recommendations will include documentation in terms of options considered and advantages and disadvantages associated with their recommendation. So that's next for this project. I'll share our contact information, and I will pass it over to Anthony if he has any last comments, and then to conclude the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. And big thank you to all the presenters this morning. Those were 3 really interesting presentations, and of course, thanks to everyone that was able to participate as well, and of course to Michaels for facilitating and handling all of the questions. As Carl mentioned, we'll spend I think probably the balance of the year now working with the Technical Advisory Committee. Our contact details are on the slide here if you do have an interest in participating in that group. If you've already expressed interest, expect to hear from Carl or myself in the very near future. Otherwise, if you can, hang on and complete the poll. That would be much appreciated, just to get sort of that last bit of information from this group before we go into the advisory committee process. And then if you are not part of that process, do expect to hear from us either later this year or the beginning of next year to reconvene this large group to really report back on what the advisory committee has found, what they're recommending, and we will go from there. But many thanks to you for participating over this last couple of weeks, and looking forward to a very productive fall. So with that, we'll sign off and speak to everyone soon. Thanks a lot.